Ani, Bojo. Welcome everyone to the Margaret Laurence lecture with our very special guest, Sara Ahmed. I'm so excited. Jen Cole Nadishnakas. My name's Jen Cole and I'm from Kijisibi territory. I'm mixed ancestry Algonquin, so that's my home territory. It's the Ottawa River watershed and it's a pretty big space. My grandparents are from settlements at Bissett's Creek and Mattawa. And right now I'm in the Gojiwanong in Mississauga Anishinaabe territory, which is also where the Department of Gender and Social Justice is. And actually, just like if you want to imagine it, right behind me, the Odanabe River is flowing. And so she's the one who flows like a beating heart. While I was walking today, I was thinking about the things that I've learned reading some of your work, Sara, and those things are like how intelligent our senses are and how powerful embodied knowledge is and how we can create collectivity across time and space. And while I was walking, I was thinking in this territory, which is Treaty 20, Williams Treaty, Dish with One Spoon, territory, it was like, oh my gosh, so many of these teachings are in these lands too. And I think one really powerful scholar whose work I'd like to lift up, thinking about the intellectual traditions of this place, is Leanne Simpson, who's from here and articulates so well ancestral, deep, old Anishinaabe teachings and practices for living and relating and connecting to one another, and how these are living in the present. But I was just thinking, like, these lands, from what I know, as I read more Leanne Simpson and get to know more Anishinaabe folks here, these lands like celebrate queerness and don't care that much about heteronormativity and have witnessed for millennia anti-oppressive practices and deep reciprocity and respect and collectivity. And so I got really excited about today and how what you teach me, Sara, is so connected to what these lands teach me. Chimigwach.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that beautiful welcome. Jen Cole is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender and Social Justice at Trent University. And I'm Kelly McGuire, and the chair, and as a guest and settler on Mississauga Anishinaabe territory. I am also grateful for the teachings of the First Peoples and their care for the earth. On behalf of the department, I just wanted to thank all of you for coming out to join us today. And a big thank you especially to Sara Ahmed for taking the time to speak with us. The massive amount of interest in this event, with over 1,000 of you signing up from across North America and the UK, speaks to just how much admiration we all have for Sara Ahmed and her work, and rightly so. Niall Banji, an assistant professor in gender and social justice, will be introducing our speaker momentarily, and I'll just take an opportunity to say a couple of words right now about the event and the series. This year actually marks our 35th anniversary as a department, and this event is one of several we're going to be holding to celebrate the past, honor our feminist founders, and envision a future for gender and social justice at Trent. After a 2-year hiatus, thanks to COVID, this is our 28th annual lecture in the Margaret Laurence Lecture Series, which is funded by a generous endowment from the Bennett Family Foundation. This series honors the esteemed novelist and former Trent Chancellor, Margaret Laurence, for her countless contributions to feminist literature in Canada. Given Sara Ahmed's own role in profoundly shaping feminist thought over the course of her career, as well as her inspiring efforts to advance equity and social justice, especially in institutional settings, I can't think of a more ideal speaker for us today than Sara Ahmed, who is joining us, I might add, just 2 days after International Women's Day. With that, I will hand you over to Niall to introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Kelly, and welcome to Trent University, Sara. We are absolutely thrilled to have you visiting, albeit virtually, with the Department of Gender and Social Justice. I want to open my introductory comments by saying that I have a complaint. My complaint is this: it is almost impossible for this junior scholar to introduce our distinguished guest in under 4 minutes, very strict timeline. I am, of course, kidding. I'm absolutely honored to introduce you here today, Sara. And I'm going to try my best to summarize the undeniable impact that Sara's work and activism has had on feminist scholarship, on institutional and on non-institutional life. Sara Ahmed is a feminist writer, an independent scholar, and an activist whose prolific publications continue to inspire us to return to the homework that is living a feminist life. Through her writing, we grapple with the ongoing legacies of strange encounters in post-coloniality, a world that asks its willful subject to think through differences that matter, where being included might demand a cultural politics of emotion that perhaps challenges the promise of happiness. I tried really hard with that intro, and if you've been keeping track, I've managed to hit about 8 of her books so far. We're still missing some of my favorites: Queer Phenomenology, What's the Use, as well as her co-edited monographs, Uprootings, Regroundings, Thinking Through the Skin, and Transformations. On a more serious note, though, Sara's most recent monograph, Complaint, illustrates, and quite starkly, the ongoing abuses of power in the academy. Throughout her book, her accounts of the terse dismissals, strategic resistances, and numerous cold silences serve as a wretchedly familiar backdrop, a kind of intimate language that betrays the calculated logics of ongoing whiteness and sexism in institutional life. Complaint really should be required reading for everyone in the academy. Now, before I turn it over to Sara, I want to draw your attention to this content warning. If you've read Complaint, you will know that she deals with some difficult and sensitive material around harassment and assault, themes that will be touched upon in today's lecture. So we're asking that you help work with us to make sure that the space stays as respectful, inclusive, and safe as possible for everyone. Now, there will be a question and answer section after the talk, and it will be facilitated by Lisa Boucher, who is also a faculty member in the Department of Gender and Social Justice. So you're very welcome to post your questions into the question and answer space at any point over the next hour. We also want to do our best to ensure that students, precarious faculty, BIPOC guests, and alumni have an opportunity to ask their questions. To that end, should you belong to one of these groups and you feel comfortable self-identifying when you post your discussion question, it'll help us to ensure that we've got equitable representation. And with that, I'm going to contain my excitement and turn it over to Sara Ahmed. Welcome again.
Thank you so much now for that introduction, and I'm quite impressed with all the book titles weaved into a story like that. It's just lovely to be here with you all, and thanks to Jen for the welcome, and Leanne Simpson for the wisdom, Kelly for organising and collaborating so carefully, so much feminist care in this event. I really appreciate it, and thanks to everybody who's here. Let me first share my screen. So my lecture is entitled Complaint as a Queer Method. You might have a fight on your hands. You might have to fight for room to be, room to do your work without being questioned or being put under surveillance. You might have to fight to find a safe path through life, a way of progressing, of getting through without having to give up yourself or your desires. A fight can be how we acquire wisdom. We know so much from trying to transform the worlds that do not accommodate us. But that fight can also be just damn hard. When you have to fight for an existence, you can end up feeling that fighting is your existence. And so we need each other. We need to become each other's resources. When I think of complaint as a queer method, I am pointing to this history of how we had to fight for room, and how by taking up that fight, not giving up, not giving in, we became each other's resources. We have queer programs, spaces and events, not just because they are nice things to have, although they are that, what a relief, but because we need them to survive institutions that are not built for us. In my recent book, Complaint, I thus describe complaint as counter-institutional work. To create spaces within institutions, we often end up having to work against them. I was inspired to do this research by my own experience supporting students who had made a collective complaint about sexual misconduct and sexual harassment where I used to work. Those students became my complaint collective. I am grateful that they, Leila Whitley, Tiffany Page, Alice Corbell with Heidi Hasbrook, Christa Sedrolia, and others, wrote one of the two conclusions of the book about the work they began as students. In the conclusion to their conclusion, they write about how they moved something, how things are no longer as they were. To move something within institutions can be to move so much, and it can take so much. I introduced the idea of complaint as a queer method in my conclusion, chapter 8. So today I want to say a little bit more about what I mean by this. And by complaint, I include not just the formal mechanisms, but also complaint in its more affective and embodied senses. I'm especially interested in how some of us are heard as complaining, as being negative, as well as saying something negative. To be heard as complaining is not to be heard. This is the opening sentence of the book, deliberately strongly worded. Listen to this description by a lesbian academic. If you have a situation and you make a complaint, then you are the woman who complains, the lesbian who complains. And then you get witch hunted, you get scapegoated, you become the troublesome uppity woman, you become the woman who does not fit, you become everything the bully accuses you of, because nobody is listening to you. And you don't like to hear yourself talking like that, but you end up being in that situation again. You can hear them saying, oh, there you go. We both laughed when she said this, recognizing that each other recognized that scene. We can hear each other in the wear and the tear of the words we share. We can hear what it's like to come up against the same thing over and over again. So complaint seems to catch how those who challenge power become sites of negation. The complainer as a container of negative affect, a leaky container, speaking out as spilling over. Negation can be quite a sensation. Think too of the word queer. We reclaim that word that has been used against us as insult, as slur, not by trying to separate ourselves from the negativity, but by repurposing that negativity as a tool. Perhaps complaint too is a repurposing of negativity as a tool. So by complaint as queer method, I'm also thinking then of my own method of listening to those who complain, hearing that negativity, as well as a way of gathering and holding the data only to let it spill. So I think of my method as all about ears, not queer eye for the straight guy, but queer ears for my queer peers. So this first section is called Complaints as Coming Out Stories. Complaints tend to be made confidential as soon as they are lodged. So they happen behind closed doors, which is why there are so many doors in the stories. Perhaps a queer ear is also an ear to the door. We listen not just through the door, but to the door. It was very early on in the research that I noticed how doors kept coming out, actual doors, doors with difficult to use handles, revolving doors, glass doors, doors as figures of speech to say what we can and cannot do, where we can and cannot go. And that expression behind closed doors can refer to the actual doors that might need to be closed so somebody can share their story in confidence. But it can also be used to describe the process of keeping something secret from a wider public. So in the book, I'm trying to open a door to let out or to express something that has been kept secret. And it can take time to open that door. A student is being harassed by her supervisor. She's a queer woman of colour. She's from a working class background. She's the first person in her family to go to university. She's had to fight really hard to get here. But she knows something is not quite right. Her supervisor keeps pushing the boundaries, wanting to meet off campus, then at coffee shops, then at his house. She tries at first to handle the situation. I try very hard to keep all the meetings on campus and to keep the door open. She keeps the door open, an actual door, at the same time as she closes another kind of door. We might call this door the door of consciousness. I thought I would take myself down by admitting to the kind of violence he was enacting. Take myself down, to admit to violence can feel like becoming your own killjoy, getting in the way of your own progression. To admit can mean to confess a truth as well as to let something in. So note then how doors can hold a contradiction. Keeping the office door open is an admission of a truth that she handles by not letting it in. But handles can stop working. I was sitting with another colleague at another lunch another day, and he started texting me these naked photos of himself, and I think I just hit a critical mass of like, I just can't handle it anymore. I said, just look at this. And she was just like, like completely speechless. And then it suddenly started to seep into me, into her, in this shared conversation about how horrible and violent that I'm having to receive these things, right? And so that basically put a process in motion. A handle is sometimes what we use to stop the violence directed at us from seeping into us or leaking into us. When the handle stops working, the violence seeps in, and it seeps into her, but it also seeps into her colleague. It seeps into the conversation. It seeps into the space in which they are having that conversation. When complaints are about something directed towards an object, what they are about is hard to contain. Objects shatter. Complaints can then queer time as well as space. They can end up all over the place, as you do. When the violence gets in, the complaint comes out. However, there's no switch, one in, one out. For a complaint to come out, she has to make the complaint and to keep making it. I think I started to believe that if I came out with this in a public way, that my own career would suffer. Her use of the language of coming out, her reference to in a public way, teaches us how, when complaints travel, going further away from us, they take something of ourselves with them. And to come out with a complaint, to keep coming out with it, is to send it right out into the same world the complaint is about. Hence the title, the second part of the book, is The Imminence of Complaint. Judith Butler asked back in 1991, is a subject who is out, free of subjection, and finally in the clear? I think we know the answer is no. Butler extends, conventionally one comes out of the closet, so we're out of the closet and into what? What new unbounded spatiality, the room, the den, the attic, the basement, the house, the bar, the university. Butler then evokes another closure with a door, Kafka's door, a door that seems to promise something, an opening, fresh air, the light of illumination that never arrives. To come out in the form of a complaint about something that happened to you is also not to be in the clear, because to come out with a complaint is to come into the world that won't admit so much and so many. So you might admit what happened, but then when you try and share the story as she did, you hear more doors being shut. To come into is also to come to. You have to bring your complaint to someone, a person, an office. So she goes to the office responsible for handling complaints. They were like, you can file a complaint, but he's really well loved by the university. He's a strong publication record. You're going to go through all of this emotional torment. It was even proposed that he could counter-sue me for defamation of character. The line was essentially, "You can do this, but why would you?" A warning that a complaint will have dire consequences takes the form of what I call institutional fatalism. Statements about what institutions are like, what they are as what they will be, who they will love, who they will protect. In the end, she does not file a formal complaint because she knew what she was being told, that she wouldn't get anywhere, that it wouldn't get anywhere because he was going somewhere. What then is the relationship between institutional fatalism and what I've called elsewhere queer fatalism? Queer fatalism is the assumption that to be queer is to hurtle toward a miserable fate, that to be queer, a life treated as a lifestyle, is to put yourself in harm's way, so that if shit happens, and let's face it, shit happens, it is what you brought on yourself. The trajectory of a complaint can be a rather queer trajectory. Being warned not to complain is to be told to straighten yourself out, to align yourself with the institution, to value what it values, to love whom it loves, to protect whom it protects, in order not to deprive yourself of a brightly lit path. And if you leave that path, if you complain not just about somebody who is loved and protected, but the system of protection, what then? You open the door of consciousness only to find another door being shut. That is how, also why, doors tell us about time, the time of repetition, what we keep having to do, the points we keep having to make. It can take time and also work for complaints to come out. Queer and trans folk know that coming out is not a one-time event. You have to keep coming out with it. Because of how the world presumes a certain kind of body, you might have to correct pronouns being used for yourself or your partner, coming out as that tiring work of correction. And correction is often heard as complaint, as being negative, as being assertive, as being demanding. If you have to keep coming out with it, in or out can feel rather more like round and about. I think of how Ahmed Ibrahim disrupts the framing of inside and outside by revisiting the closet in a powerful reflection on queer lives and archives in Egypt. Ibrahim uses the language of seepage, how queerness seeps out, complicating any distinction between inside and outside. And there are so many seepages in stories of complaint. An early career lecturer is being sexually harassed by a senior man professor in her department, mainly through constant verbal harassment. He emailed her, for example, about wanting to suck her toes. She thought she'd handle this by asking her line manager to ask him to stop, not knowing that her line manager had sat on that request. So when a complaint is not passed on, the harassment goes on. And then I was in a meeting with my line manager and her line manager. We were in this little office space, like a glass fishbowl type meeting room. And then the main office where all the staff desks were, and he emailed me and I made a sound, ah! There's no way to articulate it. Someone's just dragging your insides like a meat grinder. Oh God, this is not going to stop. And I made that sound out loud. And my line manager said, what's happened? And I turned my computer around and showed him, and he said, for fuck's sake, how stupid do you have to be to put that in an email? You could see a look of panic on her face, like, crap, this is not magically gone away. That sound, that pierces the meeting taking place in the little glass room, that fishbowl, where they can all be seen. Something can become visible and audible, sometimes even despite yourself. A complaint is what comes out because you can't take it anymore. You just can't take it anymore. Your inside's like a meat grinder. A complaint is how you're turned inside out. And note how the problem once heard is implied to be not so much the harassment, but that there was evidence of it. For fuck's sake, how stupid do you have to be to put that in an email? So a sound can become a complaint because it brings to the surface a violence that is already in the room, but otherwise would not have to be faced. And her line manager's line manager, now alerted and also importantly witnessed having been alerted, then initiates a formal complaint process. So the lecturer used the word imploded to describe what happened next. She attends another meeting. And this meeting dragged on, and it was sort of going through all the points. My boss wasn't in it, wasn't party to it. And it became clear at this point that something is going on beyond what I'm involved in. That was the first time I realized the level of mess that is accompanying this. The professor disappeared. He was suddenly not there anymore. Whether he'd been suspended or whether he quit, I never knew. But the story he had told to my colleagues was that he'd been forced out by me. You've heard all of this 1,000 times. A story can be familiar. We've heard it before because it's happened before. So even though she didn't initiate the formal complaint process, she's described by him as having forced him out. And there's no way for her to challenge the narrative because she's been told this is confidential. Her colleagues begin to refer to her as the woman who forced a man out of his job because he said he wanted to suck her toes. So in practice, confidentiality, often justified as necessary to protect those who complain, means that those with more connections have more control over how the complaint is framed. This is how the story of what happens to a complaint can be the same story that complaints are about. Who controls the situation? Who controls the narrative? Complaints as stories about institutions. So I wanted to begin with these two stories of how complaints come out, these rather messy, queer stories. The institutional story of complaint is rather different. So on paper, I think of this as an institutional story. A complaint is often pictured as a flowchart with straight lines and pointy arrows that give the would-be complainer a clear route through. Things are not always as they seem. If you were to picture a complaint from the complainer's point of view, it would look rather more like this. It's a mess, what a tangle. Once you get in, it's hard to work out how to get out. And if this is a picture of a complaint, then it can also be a picture of your life. A life can be what unravels. The early career lecturer whose complaint came out as that sound described, it's like being trapped in some kind of weird dream where you know you jump from one section to another because you never know the narrative. Making a complaint can feel like becoming a character in somebody else's story, even if or even when the complaint references something that happened to you. So you know that what's happening is not supposed to be happening, but you still don't know what is happening. And other people don't know what you're doing. And this is what I really remember from my own experience. You're having all these conversations, meetings after meetings, more meetings, but most of the people you're working with don't know what is going on. And you keep having to go back to your other job, your day job, and that world is supposed to be the real world, becomes, increasingly topsy-turvy or upside down. So I think about the way in which complaints then can queer your relation to the institution. And I mean queer in the old sense of the word of odd. Complaints can make everything seem odd, and words that are everywhere in my data, in addition to weird and odd, are strange and surreal and bizarre and disorientating. So this lack of clarity, it becomes the world that you inhabit. One academic made a complaint about bullying by her head of department, and she did so in part because her university had invested in a great deal of time and resources in developing new policies and complaints procedures. She described them as window dressing and said they did not mean what they said. So policies can be how the organisation appears from the front, window dressing. When you complain, you begin to see through that appearance. This is why I've described complaint as a kind of phenomenology of the institution. You go back, you see things that don't appear from the front. To complain is certainly to go back in time. You have to go back over what is not over. Complaints have a queer temporality, well described by Elizabeth Freeman's term temporal drag. Complaints go on, meetings go on and on. But to complain is also to go back in a spatial sense. You see what is behind the back, to reuse terms from my book, Queer Phenomenology. So another academic tried to use policies in her complaint about plagiarism and racism, only to discover, using very similar terms, the policies are not meant We could call these policies non-performatives. She added, I was told it was now a formal process. I had to look at all the policies. I found there was this fog, it was constant. Every time I found clarity, isn't it supposed to happen in accordance with policy, blah, blah, blah. This has been around 10 years, isn't this supposed to happen? And they'll be like, no. To be told no is to be told that however long a policy has been around, it's not going to determine what happens. But even if these policies are not being followed, they still exist on paper and they are referenced as if they determine what happens. She then described the policies that don't exist on paper as shadow policies. She used that term to account for how white academics in her department ended up with more research time than academics of colour, despite official commitments to equity, because of these backdoor deals that appeared to be about securing one thing, but ended up giving them something else, research time, that more valued thing that allowed them to do the more valued things, shadow policies. A shadow is the dark area where light from a source is blocked due to an opaque object. So the term shadow policies is telling us something about where decisions are made, as well as how they are made, those unlit areas of a room. The first part of the book, Institutional Mechanics, explores the gap between what is supposed to happen when you make a complaint and what does happen. That gap is telling us something about complaint, but it's also telling us something about the university. To complain is to find a gap between the university as it appears on paper, those policies that exist but are not followed, the paper university, diversity and equality as what they keep saying, diversity and equality as papering over, and the university as it is, policies that do not exist but are followed, inequalities as what they keep doing. So you find a gap, you mind a gap, and you fall right into it. That was why it was very important to me to show what those who complain know. I spoke to an early career lecturer who made a complaint about the failure of her university to adjust her workload after she returned from long-term sick leave. She is neuroatypical and she needs time to return to work and indeed to do her work. So she too has evidence that the university has not followed its own policies and procedures, but despite that, her complaint does not get anywhere. So let me share with you her description of what it feels like to do this work. It was like a little bird scratching away at something and it wasn't really having any effect. It was just really small, small, small and behind closed doors. I think people maybe feel that because of the nature of the complaint and you're off work, so they have to be polite and not talk about it. And so much of their politeness is because they don't want to say something. And maybe it is to do with being an institution and the way they are built, long corridors, doors with locks on them, windows with blinds that come down. It seems to sort of imbue every part of it with a cloistered feeling. There is no air, it feels suffocating. A complaint is something you are doing can acquire exteriority, becoming a thing in the world, scratching away a little bird, all your energy going into an activity that matters so much to what you can do and who you can be, but barely seems to leave a trace. The more you try, the smaller it becomes, the smaller you become, smaller and smaller still. I think of those birds scratching away, and I think back to how diversity work was described to me by a practitioner as a banging your head against a brick wall job. When the wall keeps its place, it's you that ends up sore. And what happens to the wall? All you seem to have done is scratch the surface. In other words, scratching gives you a sense of the limits of what you can accomplish. So when I heard the little birds in her story, my queer ears pricked up. In my book on the uses of use, what's the use? I use this image as an image of queer use, how things can be used in ways that were not intended, or by those for whom they were not intended. So the birds turn a postbox into a nest. I can see that this is a rather happy and hopeful image, perhaps not a typical image for a killjoy to show. Usually when we turn up in the institutions not built for us, we are told, get back in your own box, go back or go home. If a complaint is a little bird scratching away at something, the complaint is often trying to create an almost nest in a hostile environment. Why evoke that term hostile environment? Many harassment policies use the term hostile environment for the creation of a work culture that is undermining or degrading to a person or persons. In the UK, the term hostile environment has since been used by government as a name of a policy on illegal immigration. The use of a term that was already definitional of workplace harassment for a policy teaches us that harassment became a policy, a national policy. The category of illegal immigrant is a racializing category. You can be brown or black and born here and still be told to go back or to go home. Yes, that was a message sent out on a van. Racial harassment as national policy. The right to interrogate those who appear not from here. A right to interrogate those who appear not from here. The right to interrogate some because of how they appear. A trans student of colour made a complaint about sexual harassment and transphobic harassment from their supervisor, who kept asking them deeply intrusive questions about their gender and genitals. Questions can be hammering. For some, to be is to be in question. These questions were laced in the language of concern for the welfare of the students, predicated on judgments that they will be endangered if they conducted their research in their home country. Racist judgments are often about the location of danger over there, in a brown or black elsewhere. Transphobic judgments are often about the location of danger in here, in the body of a trans person, as if to be trans is to incite the violence against you. When they complain, what happens? People were just trying to evaluate whether he was right to believe there would be some sort of physical danger to me because of my gender identity, as if to say he was right to be concerned. The same intrusive questions that led you to complain are asked because you complain, the imminence of complaint. Right to be concerned, or a right to be concerned. So much harassment today is enacted as a right to be concerned. We have a right to be concerned about immigration as citizens. We have a right to be concerned about sex-based rights as adult human females, and so on. A right to be concerned is how violence is enacted, a violence premised on suspicion that some are not who they say they are, that some have no right to be where they are, or that some have no right to be. Complaints about hostile environments are made in hostile environments. A woman of colour talked to me about a conversation she had with her head of department. She's trying to explain to him why students of colour do not feel they can make complaints about racism. He said he was sympathetic because of Brexit and started talking about Muslim students being attacked on the bus. I said the department is reproducing a culture that isn't inclusive, no matter how sympathetic you are. If you had experience on the bus, you're not going to come back to the department and tell them about it, are you? If it's the same department where, when you have a cup of tea, the white people go to a different part of the room. The head of department's statement of sympathy, his performance of sympathy, is directed towards a racism that is over there. But seeing racism there can be how you don't see it here, but more than that, it can be how you enact it here, white people going to different parts of the room. So racism can be what stops a complaint about racism, or the hostile environment can be what stops a complaint about a hostile environment. I think of how policies can be about what appears, what stops us from seeing what is going on. Diversity too can be what appears, what stops us from seeing what is going on, how it is going on. So the organisation at the front might appear welcoming diversity as window dressing, but also as an open door, come in, minorities welcome. Just because they welcome you, it doesn't mean they expect you to turn up. Perhaps you open the door, that diversity door, only to end up in a hostile environment, otherwise known as the diversity committee. This woman of colour academic also described, I was on the equality and diversity group in the university, and as soon as I started mentioning things to do with race, they changed their portfolio who could be on the committee, and I was dropped. If you're dropped from the diversity committee for mentioning things to do with race, then the diversity committee is a way of not mentioning things to do with race. Diversity is how race is dropped from the conversation. Another time, she is writing a paper for a special issue of a journal on decolonising her discipline. She receives feedback from a white editor. The response of the editor was, needs to be toned down, not enough scholarly input to back up the claims they're making. Basically, get back in your box, and if you want to decolonise, we'll do it on our terms. Being dropped from the diversity committee for mentioning things to do with race is continuous. We're being told to tone it down on the decolonizing special issue. Whiteness can be just as occupying of spaces when they are designated decolonial. I sometimes call this decolonial whiteness. Get back in your own box. I think back to that post box that has become a nest. There could have been another sign on that box. Birds, welcome. Diversity is that sign. That sign would be a non-performative if the post box was still in use, because the birds would be dislodged by the letters, a nest destroyed before it could be created. All those questions, what are you, where are you from, those instructions, tone it down, more scholarly input, they function as letters in the box. They pile up until there's no room left, no room to breathe, to nest, or to be. So if diversity is that sign, diversity obscures the hostility of an environment. This third section is called An Important Man and Other Stories About Reproduction. Another story. An MA student was considering whether to complain about the conduct of a professor. She had already questioned his syllabus, which was, this is how she summarizes it, all white men until week 10. One time she has an essay tutorial with the professor, and she tells him she wants to write her essay on gender and race. He says, if you write on those fucking topics, you're going to fucking fail my course. You haven't fucking understood anything I've been talking about if you think those are the correct questions for this course. When you ask the wrong questions, you hear the violence of correction. But then he says, wait, you know what? You're so fucking old. Your grades don't really matter. You're not going to have a career in academia. So write whatever essay you wanted to write. You're going to fail, but it doesn't matter, right? She hears herself be written off. The complainer, who is questioning the syllabus, becomes a feminist who got the questions wrong, becomes the old woman who might as well be wrong, a hag as well as a nag, because she can't proceed, she won't proceed. So she decides to make a formal complaint because she wanted to prevent other students having to go through the same practice. And this is why I think of complaints as non-reproductive labour, the work you have to do to stop the same things from happening, to stop the reproduction of an inheritance. So when she tells the convener of the MA program that she's intending to complain, she receives a warning. The convener says, be careful, he is an important man, be careful. A warning not to proceed can be a statement about who is important. Importance is both a judgment, but it's also a direction. She goes ahead with the complaint, and in her terms, she sacrificed the references, and in reference to the prospect of doing a PhD, she said, that door is closed. That door is closed. References can be doors, how some are stopped from progressing. When the door is closed on her complaint and also on her, she will not be there bringing to the institution what she might have brought to it. The door is kept open for him so he can keep doing what he's been doing where he's been doing it, behind closed doors. So this figure of the important man is teaching us about how institutions work and for whom they work. A retired academic told me how her application for promotion to professor was, in her terms, put in the bin. The university decides to award only one professorship during the promotion process. So who did get put forward? And of course, it was a man far less qualified than any of the women who had applied. The head department's argument was that he had very important contacts in the community. In order to keep this guy, they had to give him the promotion because they didn't want to lose him. They didn't want to lose him. A door is open to him because of who he brings with him. Importance is so often predicated on connections, and to progress, you might be told that you need to have or to make the right connections. You might be told not to complain about an important man because you would need a reference from him, or you might be told to refer to an important man because of the influence he's had in shaping a field. The more a path is used, the more a path is used, the more he is cited, the more he is cited. We learn not just who to cite, but how to cite. Sarah Franklin has explored sexism in the academy by discussing Professor P's rather extreme response to one of her essays, a feminist essay on Durkheim. His scrawling marks made mostly with red pen all over her essay, turning it into a bloody document. Franklin shows how sexism can be a means of reproduction that works by prohibition or cultivation to select a path, for example, by blocking a conversation or an argument when it flows in the wrong direction, or enabling the right kinds of thinking or critique by creating spaces for them to move into. Prohibition or cultivation. Prohibition is perhaps a rather obvious door story, how you were stopped from doing something by being denied entry for doing it. You might end up without a career path if you don't follow the right path, disciplinary or otherwise. A path, a line. I think of how in that decolonizing special issue, a woman of color was told to sort of toe the line, to tone it down. Maybe she was being told not just to remove herself from the text, but to cite right, to cite white. But cultivation, Franklin's other term, is also, I think, a door story, perhaps less obviously so, but a door story. Nevertheless, what you were told you need to do in order not to have a door closed on you. So earlier I suggested warnings not to complain could be how you were told to straighten yourself up, to align yourself with the institution, to love who it loves, protect who it protects, and so on. Warnings not to complain are part of a cluster of speech acts that we sometimes call career advice. So career advice equals straightening device. So not complaining becomes then about developing a more positive attitude to the institution and its legacies. A woman of colour academic I spoke to describes not complaining as part of the culture of the institution. You don't complain about the culture of the institution, that's the culture of the institution. There's an agreement between people not to rock the boat. People would talk about the institution as a kind of legacy project. It would imply that you just didn't understand how the institution was formed. The implication was that you have to be respectful of how this place was organised and what its traditions were essentially. And if you're not abiding by that, it was because you've not been there for 10 years. When a legacy becomes a project, it signals a relationship to what has been received from the past. Think of the words she uses: respectful, abiding, also understanding. The implication is that to complain is to provide evidence that you have not been in an institution long enough to understand it, to respect it, how it's organised, its traditions. So you can become a complainer when you have not or not yet internalised the norms of the institution. I noted in my introduction that the figure of the complainer becomes a container of negative affect. Negation is also a relation to the institution. You become a complainer when you fail to reproduce an institutional legacy. Remember the woman of colour who was dropped from the diversity committee for mentioning things to do with race. All you have to do is use that word race to be heard as a complainer. The word itself can be evidence that you've not internalized the norms of the institution. She explains, whenever you raise something, the response is, you're not one of them. You're not one of them. A complaint seems to amplify what makes you not fit, picking up on what you are not. The complainer becomes a stranger, which is why and also how you don't have to make a complaint to become a complainer. I spoke to a lesbian academic who became the first woman to be head of her department, let alone the first lesbian. One time she's introduced by a student as a lesbian head department. There was some discussion of that with colleagues, like I had some banner to fly, pushing students to get involved with this. Just being called a lesbian head department can be heard as pushing an agenda. So some are judged as pushy, as rocking the boat, imposing themselves just by virtue of not being or doing more of the same. Being called a lesbian academic is akin to raising something whenever you raise something, rather like a flag. So when you raise something or something is raised about you, it can be treated as evidence that you do not belong here, that you're not supposed to be here. And belonging can then be expressed quite quickly as both kin and kind. Another lesbian academic describes an incident. It was really weird. It was in the school office. He started talking about one of my classes and he said, the external examiner said something. And I said, I don't actually agree with the external examiner. And he said, well, fuck you. You don't fucking know anything. The external examiner is a major professor, and no doubt an important man. Fuck off. Who the fuck do you think you are talking about him like that in front of other people? I later found out that the external examiner was one of his closest friends. So I went to the head of school and I said, this happened. And she said, you know, he's like the naughty uncle of the school. That's just how he is. You just have to let it go. You just have to let it go. Friendship networks, family connections. The naughty uncle appears here as a figure, as familiar, but also as an instruction to let it go, not to complain, to accept the shouting and abusive behavior, because that is what families are like, because that's what families do. So the complainer becomes not just not us, but also not part of the family. To be one of them, you have to be in relation to an important man. In other words, you have to become his relative. I think of how one postdoctoral researcher was unable to get anyone to support her complaint about her mentors. And one student said to her, I've been here since I was 17 years old. I grew up with them. I can't do anything. To progress as a student becomes akin to growing up. Complaining becomes something you cannot do. It's about what you know, who you know, it's about what you owe. And what you cannot do is what protects them. I communicated with an academic whose work was plagiarized by a colleague. The chair told her to keep quiet about it because they were a family. The chair kept reminding her as a lesbian that he has a wife and child. So she could hear what she was being told, that by complaining, she would damage not just him, but his family. Perhaps that reminder is being addressed to her as somebody assumed not to have a family in need of protection. So the protection of a person becomes a protection of their relations. So when I hear protection, I hear silence. And when I think back to my own experience of complaint, that's what I hear. I hear silence. Silence can be a wall. I think of all our efforts over 3 long years to try and get the university to acknowledge the problem of sexual harassment. We could not even get an acknowledgement in public that these inquiries that had taken place had taken place. It was like they had never happened, which was, I have no doubt, the effect they were looking for. The very first mention of the inquiries was, in fact, on this post of mine, written just after I resigned, which is probably telling me a little about why I resigned. The university treated my post and my resignation as a leak, as making a mess, as causing damage. But it was not just the university that treated this disclosure as damaging. A feminist colleague described my action as unprofessional because it caused a fallout which damages us all now and in the future. So I think we're learning here what it can mean to be professional. To be professional can be to be willing to keep the institution's secret. So it's important to note that silence is not just something enforced by management or marketing departments. Silence can be performed as loyalty, turned into a duty by our own colleagues, including feminist colleagues. Silence to protect important people, silence to protect resources, silence to protect reputations, both individual and institutional, silence as promotion, how you maximize your chances of getting further or getting more from the institution. In other words, if the story of an important man is a story of who is protected and promoted, it is also a story of how many get enlisted into doing that work. Another early career lecturer talked about why people don't make complaints in her university because of who would receive them. People don't want to rock the boats with senior academics because they are so important and they bring in this grant money and their names really matter. Not wanting to rock the boat can be part of an effort to maintain good relations to those who are more important because of how they bring in more resources. So much violence is enabled and reproduced because people do not think they can rock the boat, which means there's so much violence in keeping things steady or in steadying. When you complain, especially in public, you are then judged as trying to make the whole thing unsteady, as damaging us all. And us all translates really into those for whom the institution means more resources. Audre Lorde told us this would happen. She said that those who are resourced by the master's house will find those who try to dismantle it, perhaps even just those who question what he's doing in there, threatening. That is Lorde's word. If to complain is to hear silence, to complain is also to hear the clunk clunk of the institutional machinery, how the system is working by stopping those who are trying to stop it from working. We know how institutions reproduce themselves when we try to intervene in that reproduction. So when you make a complaint, you might not necessarily begin by thinking of yourself as part of a movement nor as a critic of the institution, let alone as trying to dismantle the master's house to evoke again the title of Law's important essay. But that is where many who complain end up, and there is hope in that trajectory. This is my conclusion, No and Other Queer Tales. The title of the third part of the book is If These Doors Could Talk. In listening to doors, they've been talking. I've been learning about power. How the door that is kept open to some is the same door that is shut on others. The image on the front of Complaint is by the artist Rachel Whiteread. I love how the double doors are an assembly, telling us about time as well as space, how they resemble funerary slabs, telling us something about who is departed. Doors have stories to tell, and they can be how we tell our stories. Perhaps then doors themselves have queer uses. Remember the birds who turned a postbox into a nest. I think of those birds as our queer kin. They turned an opening intended for letters into a door, a queer door perhaps, a way of getting in and out of the box. So a queer door can be how we make room for ourselves. I think back to Judith Butler's discussion of coming out as coming into a bounded space, such as a basement or a university. In Undoing Gender, Butler tells another door story. She talks about being in the basement of her house, having locked the door, and in a smoke-filled, airless room, finding books that once belonged to her parents, or at least passed through their hands, philosophy books that ignited her desire. Spaces that might seem like closets or airless containers can be where queer things happen, where we pick something up that gives us somewhere else to go. A shut door, a room. I'm listening to an Indigenous academic. She told me how she could barely manage to get to campus after a sustained campaign of bullying and harassment from white faculty, including a concerted effort by a senior manager, another important man no doubt, to sabotage her tenure case, as well as the tenure case of other Indigenous academics. When doors are closed, nay, slammed in your face, it can be history that you come up against. So her complaint goes nowhere, her formal complaint. So she finds another way of taking them on. I took everything off my door, my posters, my activism, my pamphlets. I smudged everything all around the building. I knew I was going to war. I did a war ritual in our tradition. I pulled down the curtain. I pulled on a mask. My people, we have a mask. And I never opened my door for a year. I just let it be a crack. And only my students would come in. I would not let a single person come into my office who I had not already invited there for a whole year. Closing a door can be a survival strategy. And it can be how she says no to the institution that demands access to her whilst taking so much from her. So she closes the door to the institution by withdrawing herself and her commitments from it. She still does her work. She still teaches her students. She uses the door to shut out what she can and who she can. She takes herself off the door. She depersonalizes it. And she pulls down the blinds and she pulls on a mask, the mask of her people, connecting her fight to the battles that came before, because quite frankly for her, this is a war. This is a war. Our battles are not the same battles, but there are many battles happening behind closed doors. Behind closed doors, that is where complaints are often found. So that is where you'll find us too, those of us for whom the institution is not built, and what we bring with us, who we bring with us, the worlds that would not be here if some of us were not here, our bodies, our memories, our data. The more we have to spill, the tighter the hold. The more we have to spill. Many complaints end up in containers, otherwise known as filing cabinets. And I think of that filing cabinet as an institutional closet. What is buried here is what the institution does not want revealed. But we too then can be buried here. Our lives can be the detail of their documents. One student said of her complaint, it got shoved in a box. Another said her complaint went into the complaint graveyard. Perhaps filing cabinets are where complaints go to die. The filing cabinet, the door, the funerary slab. If complaints end up in the institutional closet, the work of complaint includes the work of getting the complaints out. There are many such stories in the book, and here is just one. A disabled student was not getting anywhere with her complaint about the failure of the university to make reasonable accommodations. She has a particularly difficult meeting. A meeting can be when you feel the walls coming down. But then a file suddenly appears, a load of documents turned up on the student union's fax machine. We don't know where they came from. They were historical documents about students who had to leave. The documents included a handwritten letter to a human rights charity by a former student who had cancer and was trying to get the university to let her finish her degree part-time. So how did the documents get there? Her theory is that a secretary was doing, in her terms, their own little bit of direct action, releasing the documents as a way of giving support to the complaint that she, as secretary, was not supposed to give. And it's not surprising that a secretary can become a saboteur. The word secretary derives from secrets. The secretary is a keeper of secrets. She knows where the files are. She knows how to get the stuff out. If the student I spoke to hadn't made her complaint, that letter would have stayed put, and the file too, dusty and buried. So many can be involved in pulling something out and pulling it off. A complaint made in the present can release complaints from the past, complaints as queer time. We can meet in an action without meeting in person. I think of all the different actions in the book, I've called them complaint activism. Students and academics who perform their complaints, who turn complaints into posters, put them on leaflets or express them as graffiti on books or on walls. Complaints can be sneaky as well as leaky. When it's made hard to get complaints out, complaints can be the sound of a release. Remember that, that's why I place such a strong emphasis on the sound of the work, in the work, not just the clunk clunk of the institutional machine, but also the groans and the moans of what we keep coming up against. The door slams, so we knock on the door. We knock on the door not to demand entry, but to create a disturbance. I hear Audre Lorde knocking on a door, telling us something's up. Lorde describes her fascination with a poem, The Listener, a poem about a traveller who rides a horse up to the door of an apparently empty house. The poem in Lorde's words. He knocks at the door and nobody answers. Is there anybody there, he said, and he has a feeling that there really is somebody in there. And then he turns his horse and he says, tell them I came, and nobody answered, that I kept my word. I used to recite that poem to myself all the time. It was one of my favourites. And if you'd asked me what is it about, I don't think I could have told you. But this was the first cause of my own writing. My need to say things I couldn't say otherwise, when I couldn't find other poems to serve. It's important to follow Lorde, to go where she goes. When we are fascinated by something, we do not always know why. Lorde keeps reciting the poem. She says it imprinted on her. I think of that imprint, the print of a poem on a person. The point is not the answer, whether somebody answers, but the knock. The knock is the action. You might be knocking on the door of consciousness, trying to hear something, to admit what has been shut out, what we have shut out sometimes, the violence that can make it hard to focus or to function. Or you might be knocking on the door of the master's house because you know that house is haunted. To knock on that door, to make that sound, not knock, knock, who is there, but knock, knock, we are here, is to disturb the spirits who linger here because of the violence that has not been dealt with. And scratching too. Scratching can be not just a mark, but a sound, the sound of labour, the little birds scratching away. We hear that scratching as speech, as spillage, as testimony, different ways of getting messages out, those scratches, those scrambles of letters that can be how we get our complaints on the wall. I think of how after I left my post, students put words from my work on the wall. Yes, they were taken down, but they cannot stop them from having been there. And I think too of how by resigning, saying no in public, people came to me with their complaints. And I became part of a collective, a complaint collective. We are assembled before you. Earlier, I shared a picture of what a complaint can feel like, can look like. Perhaps this picture is also a queer map of the organisation, telling us all the places we have been to try and get our complaints through. The more we don't get through, the more we have to do. Yes, this is hard, exhausting, also shattering. But think of this. Each line might be a conversation, one that you had to have, a conversation that can open a door just a little, just enough, so that somebody else can enter, can hear something. Each line might be time, the time it takes to get somewhere. Time as a queer line, going around and about is how you find things out. Each line might be a path, the places you go, the unlit rooms, the shadows, the doorways. A line as a lead, who you find on your way there. Each line might take us back, how we learn there are more, how we hear of others who complained before. Each line can be thrown forward, a leak as a lead, how those who came after you can pick something up because of what you try to do, even though you did not get through, even though all you seemed to do was scratch the surface. What you left behind, they find. That we find each other through complaint is a finding. That complaints are made is how we come to know something happened here, what happened here, know as a trail, another queer tale. Thank you.
Well, hello. First of all, Sarah, let me just be the first one to really express my gratitude for that beautiful, moving, and powerful talk. I was struck and moved in particular about the way that you just, you hold and make space for and weave together people's stories in a way with such care. And I was looking at the chat today, I could see that was really resonating with folks, and there was a lot of good radical feminist care happening there as well. So, hello everyone, my name is Lisa Boucher and I'm faculty at Trent University in the Gender and Social Justice Department, and I'll be facilitating the question and answer period today. And so as we turn to this part of the talk, just a reminder to those in the audience to post your questions using the Q&A feature. And also, as Niall mentioned at the beginning, we're trying to ensure representation. So if you are a student, precarious faculty, alumni, a BIPOC guest, please do feel free to indicate that in the question and answer box for us. So I can see all the gratitude coming your way, Sarah. Thank you again. So I'm going to start with this question. So how might we teach our students to speak in tongues sharp like daggers to raise an issue with policy or their treatment within the institution, while at the same time acknowledging the moment when a student decides one battle is enough, a complaint undocumented is all that is required. Shadow policies are vexing when enacted in earnest on behalf of a student.
It's a very good question. I mean, I think I almost just want to take the first part. How might we teach our students? I think in a way, having done this work and gathered this archive, this collection of stories, there's so much to learn about learning, about how we learn how institutions work from our efforts to transform institutions. And I think in a way, when I think about this work, it's so indebted to student activists who've really, I think, created a whole new language around complaint. And I feel that in a way I'm learning from students about how to do institutional work. So I feel like students have been teaching me a lot in the way that the stories they've shared with me and the examples they've given me have become a collective resource to think differently about the institution. I think one of the things that's really unjust is that, you know, you might expect that one of the ways in which complaints are stopped is by making them unaffordable. People can't afford to make a complaint because the complaints process is so long and so arduous, and it takes so much from you in terms of resources as well. So you might think the consequence of that would be that the more precarious you are, the less likely you are to be involved in the kinds of complaints that lead you to confront institutions. But in fact, my research has shown me that that's not the case, that actually often the people who are the most precarious are those who are fighting hardest for spaces within institutions, which often means that sometimes to show confronting them quite directly. And I don't think that's right. So in a way, one of the things I would really want sort of as a pedagogic lesson is to try and think about stopping that from being the case, that those who are the most precarious are risking so much more in the effort to build more just world. So that I would like that to be one of our primary kind of like lessons from the shared archive that is complaint is to actually think about the implications of this for understanding the political risks of precarity. That precarity can often be precisely intensified by the necessity of having to challenge the situations and institutions that make you precarious in the first place. And so much of the work of complaint ends up being done by students and early career scholars, including the work of changing policies, work of changing procedures, so that they are less like, that they are less non-performative. If one can have a lessening of non-performativity. And I think we learn a lot from hearing from those who are having to engage with these battles, including many of whom are actually students.
Yes, thank you. The way you speak about your relationship with your students and what you've learned from them is really, really quite powerful. The next question ties into some of what you're speaking to here. So how do we engage with persons and institutions who respond to similar kinds of complaints differently? In other words, how do we theorize responses, especially ones that indicate institutional inconsistencies? For instance, some people may support complaints about sexual harassment coming from a non-tenured colleague against another more powerful colleague, but not when it comes from a grad student.
I think it's I use this idea of a complaint biography in the book, which is more of the stories that we have and our changing relationships to complaints. Because when I think about complaint in relationship to our biography, my biography even, I think also of the times that I didn't complain, as well as the times that maybe I tried to complain or did complain. But I also have this idea of a biography of a complaint, like where it goes in the institution. And I think one of the things when you make a complaint is you find out a lot about yourself, about what you are willing to do and what you are not willing to do in your work. But you also find out a lot about other people. And you find out a lot about the institution, which the latter has been what I've emphasized here. But you do find out a lot about other people. And I think one of the things I would just say, it's very hard to answer this question in general, but one of the things I would say is that people are often surprised. It's my light keeps going on. Say it on. People are often surprised by who supports them and who doesn't. The support that they receive doesn't necessarily follow, for instance, political allegiance. And there are quite a few stories where somebody's been taken back, like the story of the secretary who released the file, somebody that they expected to have to toe the institutional line, because often to be administrator is to have a lot less room to do the work of critique, ends up being the person who actually makes a profound gesture of political solidarity. And there have been, unfortunately, quite a lot of stories where the people you expect to be out there backing you, supporting you, don't. You feel that they should or that they would because of their political allegiance, because you share perhaps a commitment to feminism, say, but they don't. They actually end up protecting a colleague. And so I do think there's a lot that's unexpected in responses. And that teaches us that the story of a complaint, the biography of a complaint, the complaint never has integrity. It means something and does something very differently for different communities and audiences. And I think one of the things that when you become a complainer in an institution, when you're complaining about something like harassment, which is institutionalized, it's never one person, it's an institution you're coming up against, then that's why you almost become an ethnographer of the institution. You begin to hear and to see all those unexpected things that happen that nevertheless end up leading the complaint to be managed in a very particular way. And what I really wanted to get across in the work, what was the kind of knowledge thus that people who make these kinds of complaints have of institutions, and to see that knowledge as our collective resolve. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. So another question here, how might we view the circumstances of international students within the complaints framework, given they often have a lot more to lose and a lot less support while being a site of frequent racialization and marginalization?
Yeah, I think this is very important to me, and I spoke to a number of international students, and one of the students I spoke to was talking to me about how she made a complaint about the conduct of her supervisor, and whilst she was making the complaint, of course it took her a long time. The complaint file got lost. It just took much longer than it was supposed to take, because not following the procedures often means the time lag, and drag. So it's going on, and during that time, her visa's running out. And those two things happening at the same time, your visa's running out and your complaint is open, are profoundly distressing and situation, because you can lose everything. You can be out of the country, out of your house, out of your program, out of the university, but also out of the country, out of the life that you thought you had. So there's a lot at stake, and that makes it really, really hard. And also there's a whole kind of attitude around international students, I think, that in the UK at least, often seen as like what we want in terms of the certainly diversity, it's certain kind of aesthetics of diversity in terms of like a financial resource. But there is also an expectation that the international student ought to be grateful. That one way in which diversity works and is racializing is the expectation of gratitude. So that to complain as an international student, also you have to push against that very narrowing expectation that you're lucky to be there studying here, that what you receive is a gift to you. And that you know, I think there's a lot of politics to who is presumed to be or who is required to be grateful that we need to unpack. But I think that really does manifest for international students in a very particular kind of way.
Thank you. So many racialized and Indigenous scholars are recruited by the institution to manage the filing cabinets of complaints, a process you've described as doing the document. How can this institutional strategy be challenged? In the context, how can collective complaint making be fostered, given that these are more likely to become sneaky, leaky complaints?
Yeah, it's interesting that the rhyme really matters, sneaky, leaky. You can hear in my talk how much I'm using rhyme. I'm still trying to work out that. Yeah, I think that's a very, very good description of a very familiar problem and politics. The way in which you're recruited into not just being diversity, but actually doing diversity in the sense of having to manage difference, manage conflict away, manage yourself out of existence in a certain kind of way. That a lot of the sort of critiques of diversity work, you could also think about in terms of holding the filing cabinet. You know, you end up becoming, you know, a kind of holding the door that stops people like you from getting in, or that stops people like you from causing too much trouble. So that filing cabinet, I mean, that, you know, is a container technology. Like a lot of us are held in there, but one of the ways we end up having something to do in the institution is by agreeing to hold it, to contain it. And that might be the filing cabinet in an actual literal sense, but it can also be just we can be filing cabinets. We can end up holding our complaints inside because in order to be an institution or just to enter the committee and not be, you know, the object of hostility, you end up having to appear in a certain kind of way, more professional, less rocking the boat. And in fact, the language of not rocking the boat has been used. Racialized faculty have talked to me about that. Like, you don't want to rock the boat. You want to keep your head down. I think somebody used that expression. Keep your head down. So there's a way in which what we need to do to survive the institution is partly that, not be the complainer, maximize the distance between ourselves and the complainer. But those same actions also become how we get recruited by the institution to do the work it does of holding and containing the complaints which would reveal something else about the institution, its white supremacist realities. So what part was it actually? I'm not sure if there's actually an answer to the question in that, other than to say, I think it's really important to recognize how hard it can be to have room in institutions like this, and that sometimes what can look like just holding the door for the institution can be someone doing the best that they can to survive it. And sometimes it's quite hard to tell the difference between survival and recruitment. And maybe that difficulty of telling the difference is telling us something in and of itself about institutions and the way they work. Thank you for the question there.
Sorry, the questions are moving on me. So I think that this ties into our conversation here, but somebody asked, can you please explain how these issues intersect with those in precarious academic positions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important. But what I really want to stress is the so much of the political labor of complaints, where the complaint ends up pressing against the institution, it becomes about the institution which you're making, it ends up being done by those who are more precarious. And I think there's something in that. I think with all kind of diversity work in general, I mean, I'm understanding complaint as part of diversity work here, that those who are more precarious tend to do that kind of work. That kind of work tends to be the less valued work. It tends to be kind of quote unquote the dirty work. And I think there's a way in which who does the work of complaint about the institution becomes part of the reproduction of the institution. I think there's a way in which also, I've talked a lot about the language of, sort of thinking about the reproduction of legacies. I mean, there's a way in which when you're precarious, you're receiving messages all the time when you're trying to get a foot in the door. You're being, that's why the door matters so much. You're constantly being told this is what you shouldn't do in order to get somewhere. So there's a way in which you inherit these very, very powerful kind of judgments and warnings about what you have to give up in order to be in the institution. And you sometimes, for racialized precarious staff, you're being told to give up yourself. Like you're being told to give up the knowledges that you have that bring you to the work that you do in order to appear in such a way that would allow you in. And that's like such an impossible bind, because then what does that mean? And I think there's sort of a story that, once you become more secure, then you can do more interesting work. Like, yeah, that doesn't happen. And once you become more secure, then you'll have room to do the work of critique. But by then, maybe it's too late. And there's a way in which I actually think, I don't think any of that, I think it's really important to remember that those warnings don't always work. And that actually the people who are often the most precarious, who are told they can't do X or Y in order to get somewhere, are those who are actually doing the work of trying to free academic knowledge from its containers and our understandings of what is worth something of value from the very narrow models of what counts. And so I think this is in a way trying to sort of pay attention not only to the ways in which sometimes certain people end up doing certain kinds of political labor that's seen as less valuable, but also to be very careful not to have the institution's judgment in your mind when you look at that labor. Because I actually think, even though it's very, very frustrating that these inequalities are reproduced in terms of who does what, that actually doing, I've called it earlier, dirty work, the administrative work, certain kinds of work, that's actually where really, really interesting things happen. And I think, that the kind of like more inventive and creative intellectual labor often comes out of a struggle with the institution, which is not to romanticize that struggle by any means, but it is to say that struggle shouldn't just simply be seen as trying to become part of something. The struggle against something can give us other ideas for what institutions can be. But there's so much more one could say about this, but I won't say it right now.
So we have a question here about complaint as method. So the audience member says, you said that complaint is the repurposing of negativity into a tool. People may complain because they are optimistic or hopeful that doing so will make a difference. Others do not complain because they feel pessimistic about the outcome. Could you say a little bit about the relationship between hope and complaint? Is having hope for change, for justice to be seen a prerequisite to making a complaint, a hindrance, or an asset?
These are really good questions too. And I've called at certain points complaint a kind of weary hope. It's not the kind of forward thrusting agentic hope. It's quite close to the ground. And I do think there's a lot of hope in these stories, in these accounts. And I think also one of the things I really noticed is when I was listening to people's stories and making complaints, I felt a sense of hope and a sense of there's a point to this. There's a point and there's a purpose, no matter how hard the stories are and how much trauma there is, and they are hard and there is trauma. There's something else that I kept hearing in people's accounts. And I think that was a sense of how hard people were willing fight for something, for who they wanted to be or what they wanted to do, and for another idea of the institution, that there was a commitment to the point and to the purpose of complaint in the complaint. I remember once speaking to one early career woman of color academic, and she said that, you know, she started off early in her career, she used the expression bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I remembered as I was saying this, but they gradually became a little wearier over time as her complaints didn't get anywhere. And she was describing this to me, but she said that when she looked back at her early complaints, she sort of felt a sense of pride. I don't know if she used that word, but she said she felt looked back and thought, you know, like, I had a go. That was her expression. I had a go. She tried something. She didn't get anywhere on the early complaints that she made when she was bushy-tailed and bright-eyed. But she looked back and thought, you know, I had a go. And she had, like quite a few people I spoke to, had a really big complaint file that she shared with me. So I could see all the work that she did. And she said that, you know, it really mattered that she had that record. And it was actually listening to her and to others who talked about their files, you know, and sort of showed me their files. I've had this idea that the complaint becomes like a noisy companion, telling you something about what you have done, but somehow also mattering because it's almost independent of you. It's a thing in the world that you put out there by doing what you have done in relationship to an institution. So she said, you know, I realized that it wasn't about social justice. She said, I didn't complain because I thought I would get justice. This is not for her about justice. It was just, you know, you're trying to hold the institution to account. You're trying to do something, and that there's a kind of hope to that. In that. So I think, you know, when I think about repurposing negativity, I'm partly thinking about the way in which to complain is to be heard as being negative. And in a way, your relation to the institution becomes that negation because of how you are heard. I mean, you could just say the word race to be heard as being negative. You just can be called a lesbian department to be heard as being negative. So it's not necessarily about the attitude or feeling that you have in relation to the institution that's at stake in the idea of repurposing negativity as a tool. And I think in the repurposing, like saying no to the institution, there is a kind of like a combination of an optimism or a sense of the point to the process of struggling against something. A pessimism is there too, though, because you become more and more aware of all the ways in which institutions don't do something. You acquire that kind of institutional knowledge, all those shadow policies. So it's a really queer combination of optimism and pessimism, negation and something more positive all at once. And there's so much emotion and so much mess at stake in what it feels like to keep doing that work.
Thank you. Yeah. So just this knowledge gained and the work mattering. So the next question is, how do you see ableism in the academy intersecting with other equity group struggles? I'm a professor with a disability and find your work very important to us in disability studies. Thank you.
The work that of complaint, the research that I did was profoundly influenced, I think, by the testimonies I gathered from disabled students and academics about academic ableism. I draw on a couple of the stories today, but I think that when I think about it, particularly about the middle part of the book, the chapter Occupied, which was influenced by Rosemary Garland-Thompson's idea of misfitting in particular, but the so much of my account of how institutions are built for some to enable and to ease their progression, and how they stop or block their not just access, that they stop or block you from entering. You can't get to the door, let alone through the door, but they stop you from being able to do the work because the time, the temporal norm the institution has, the spatial arrangements that they have are simply not built for certain kinds of bodies and minds. And I think the way in which a lot of the stories that I collected from disabled academics and students were also about, like, so you make a complaint about that. In fact, you're often heard as complaining before you even make the complaint. You just might ask for reasonable accommodations. You're already heard as complaining, even though it's not a complaint, it's an entitlement. You're heard as that, and you have to counter that perception of you as being a problem, a nuisance. But then you make the complaint, and then you encounter the ableism that leads you to complain in how your complaint is received. You're not given the time that you need. You're not given the support that you need. And so the kind of way in which identifying the structure leads the structure to become intensified, like you encounter it all the more because you're trying to stop something, the institution, the way in which it doesn't enable you, trying to stop that from happening, then you become even more pushed out by the institution itself. I think a lot of those stories have really come out of of this testimony shared with me about ableism. And I think that, yes, they're absolute intersections. And I think in a way, one of the reasons I wanted to make complaint my kind of thread, the connection. And it's not even the people who've made formal complaints, because quite a few people who shared testimonies with me shared testimonies about not making formal complaints. Like they thought about it when they didn't do it, and then they gave me the reasons. But making complaint in the thread rather than, say, sexual harassment, which my experience began with the experience of being, working with students on a sexual harassment complaint. I didn't make sexual harassment the focus, I made complaint the focus, partly because I thought complaint brings things so close. It brings into focus something that what you're complaining about comes up closer to you. And in a way, then as a lens, it allows you to understand how all these different forms of power intersect in a kind of very messy way. And I think the ways in which so many of these power relations manifest in terms of exhaustion, I mean, that will be an absolute common theme, the exhaustion of complaint, how long it takes to make a complaint, but also the exhaustion of trying to work your way through an institution that was not intended for you. I think that is a thread that really gets us to think about the relationship between racism, racial harassment, sexual harassment, ableism, because in a way, to harass, to be tired out, to be vexed, to be exhausted by what gets repeated over and over again, the almost like the effective response to a structure is what connects all these different forms of power, and making those connections visible as well as making them matter is absolutely key to the work itself. I hope that is shown in the work. So thank you for a really important question.
So the next question is about really a culture of silence and within an institution. So this person writes, our institution has a culture of silence and our staff are suffering because of it. People are afraid to bring up any issue out of fear of losing their jobs, and we don't have work protections where I live. I've already brought several issues to HR and the administration directly on behalf of staff, and those have largely been dismissed. Do you have advice on persisting in complaint as a means of advocating for staff who don't have any legal protections?
I wanted to have the slide of silence and the wall, because I think that's one of the hardest things is the institutionalization of silence. Like you can really hear it when you know what's not being said and what's not being done and what's not being dealt with. It is the loudest thing, silence. And I think it's really, really hard because it goes back again to precarity and simply not having, in a way, a secure enough institutional footing to allow you to even to mention something or to raise something informally. I've noticed a lot how warnings work. It can be an explicit culture of don't do that, you're not allowed to do that, you don't have a route through institutionally, but it can also be the kind of oblique warnings that are all about, oh, if you did that, then that would, the kind of like concern for your career. There's a lot of concern. There's a lot of concern in this data. People are very, very concerned. If you make a complaint, you'll become known as a troublemaker. That's what one student was told by his supervisor. I'm just worried that other people think you're a troublemaker. Or all the different ways you're told that if you complain in the sense of vocalizing a no to something, not being silent about it, that you'll be compromising your own trajectory, and there's truth to the warnings, and you worry. The culture of silence can also be a culture of worry about the consequences of actions and the kind of deflection of the point of the action into a concern for the consequence of the action as part of that wider culture. Do I have advice? I mean, oh my gosh, I wish I had more advice and better advice. I'm like the killjoy advisor. My advice is to killjoy. No, that's not true. I think that when I think to all the stories that I've collected and all the people I've listened to, I think the common feature of accounts that had a kind of more optimistic sort of feel to them would be those who worked with other people. It's that as simple as that. When I heard stories of people like feeling like they got somewhere, they didn't necessarily get what they wanted or thought they were aiming for. They got something. Well, when they actually formed what I've called complaint collectives, and began working with a group of people. So some of these collectives were anonymized collectives. So people, you would form a Facebook group that was people could join. You would do this relatively in secret. It'd be word of mouth, and you would have a way of communicating with each other. But you would work together to combine your resources. Different people have different skills, and sometimes some of you would come forward and use the skills that you have in a particular situation, and others would come forward at another time with their skills. And I think that kind of combining of skills and resources, the complaint collectors are also just like a support system. It can feel very lonely when you're trying to identify what has become an institutional problem, and then the silence about the problem becomes part of the institutional culture. It becomes very, very lonely, and you can feel like you're one against many. So the only way around that is to find more, and that's what people do. And in fact, they do it quite a lot. I mean, I remember one of my first interviews, I was actually really struck by how similar the students I would talk to who'd formed a group, rather like the students where I had worked. I was struck by how similar the kind of work that they did, the combination, the combining of resources, the supporting each other, being there for each other. And I think, that's really the conclusion of the book is really about that, it's a long feminist history of combining our resources, sharing our knowledge, our skills, giving support, finding out what would be supportive to somebody else, because what is supportive to one person is not always supportive to another. But doing that work of keeping the complaint going by keeping each other going, I think is really, I think, the conclusion of the work itself.
Thank you, Sarah. Your discussion of complaint collectives is so powerful and moving. That's all the time that we have today, unfortunately, for the questions. There were some wonderful questions there. Thank you to the audience for your engagement and for your thoughtfulness. I'm going to turn it over now to Carlene. And thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. I want to thank you for sharing your words with us today. I actually think that you're the strongest theorist in the world. I totally think that. And you're here with us right now, and I can't believe it. And among many other things, you can work a metaphor like nobody else. And so that means that every time you introduce something to us, we think it, and we feel it, and we see it. And you show us in that way, all of the ways that the structures in the world, the power can hurt us. And because you can show it to us so clearly in our whole bodies, I think we have a much better chance at fighting it. And I can't thank you enough for that. I also need to thank Niall Banji, because he had the guts and the imagination to ask for Sarah to come to Trent. And I want to thank Kelly McGuire for serving as chair of Gender and Social Justice and organizing this event, and to Felicia Birmingham, the coordinator of alumni services, for all of her valuable behind the scenes work. Finally, 2023 will mark the 35th anniversary of the Department of Gender and Social Justice, and we will be celebrating. So please stay tuned. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And this concludes the 28th annual Margaret Laurence Lecture.